Picture this. You're aboard a tiny wooden ship, just 70 feet long, smaller than most modern yachts. You're 1,000 miles from civilization, surrounded by an ocean that's frozen solid for as far as the eye can see. Your ship is locked in ice, so thick and powerful it could snap your vessel in half without warning. You have enough food for maybe 6 months, but you're about to be trapped for 3 years. This is the story of Roald Amundsen and his crew aboard the Gjøa, 7 men who became prisoners of the Arctic ice while attempting one of the most dangerous voyages in human history, the first successful navigation of the Northwest Passage. What started as a planned expedition became a 3-year fight for survival. Against the most hostile environment on the planet, they faced starvation, scurvy, polar bears, and temperatures that could kill you in minutes. They were so far from help that if anything went wrong, no rescue was coming. But this isn't just a story about surviving the cold. This is a story about adapting to the impossible, learning from people who had mastered the art of Arctic survival for thousands of years, and never, ever giving up on a dream that had killed dozens of explorers before them. This is the story of how 7 men in a wooden boat smaller than a city bus conquered the Northwest Passage and lived to tell about it. Get ready for 3 years of Arctic hell, where holding on meant the difference between making history and becoming another footnote in the graveyard of polar exploration.
June 16, 1903. The port of Christiania, Norway, now called Oslo. A small crowd had gathered to see off what many considered a suicide mission, disguised as a scientific expedition. The ship at the center of attention was laughably small for such an ambitious undertaking. The Gjøa, just 70 feet long and 20 feet wide, looked more like a fishing boat than a vessel capable of conquering one of the world's most dangerous waterways. But her captain, Roald Amundsen, had chosen this ship for exactly those reasons. At 31 years old, Amundsen was already a veteran of polar exploration, having survived a brutal Antarctic winter as part of an earlier expedition. He understood something that many of his predecessors had missed. Sometimes, smaller is better. The Northwest Passage, a sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic Ocean, had been the holy grail of exploration for over 400 years. It promised a shortcut to Asia that could revolutionize world trade. But it had also become a graveyard for explorers. Sir John Franklin's expedition in 1845 had ended with 129 men dead and 2 ships lost forever in the ice. Dozens of other attempts had ended in disaster, defeat, or death. The Arctic Ocean was littered with the wrecks of ships that had been too big, too heavy, or simply unlucky. Amundsen's revolutionary idea was to go small and go smart. The Gjøa drew only 9 feet of water, meaning she could navigate shallow passages that would ground larger ships. Her reinforced hull was designed to bend with the ice rather than fight it. And most importantly, she carried a crew of just 6 men plus Amundsen, small enough to survive on local resources if necessary. But small enough to survive and actually surviving were 2 very different things. The crew Amundsen had assembled was a mixture of sailors, scientists, and adventurers, each chosen for specific skills they might need in the Arctic. Godfred Hansen served as navigator and second-in-command. Anton Lund was the ship's engineer, responsible for keeping their small diesel engine running in conditions that could freeze oil solid. Peter Ristvedt was their meteorologist. Gustav Juel Wick handled magnetic observations. Adolf Henrik Lindström served as cook, perhaps the most important job on a ship where food meant the difference between life and death. And Helmer Hansen was their dog driver and ice pilot. 7 men total, setting out to accomplish what had defeated some of the best-equipped expeditions in history. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Sail north through the Norwegian Sea, around the top of Russia, through the Bering Strait, and then east through the Canadian Arctic. Find the elusive passage that connected the oceans, map it, and return home as heroes. But the reality would be far more complicated. From the moment they left Norway, nothing went according to plan. Storms battered their small ship in the North Sea. Equipment failed in the cold. Their diesel engine, revolutionary for its time, proved temperamental and unreliable. But the real challenges began when they entered the Arctic Ocean itself. The Arctic isn't just cold, it's a living, breathing entity that actively tries to kill anything foolish enough to challenge it. The ice moves constantly, crushing and grinding, opening leads that close without warning, creating pressure ridges that can tower 50 feet above the surface. As they sailed east along the northern coast of Russia, following the route of previous expeditions, they encountered ice conditions that ranged from merely dangerous to absolutely terrifying. Huge ice floes, some as large as city blocks, drifted with the current and wind, threatening to crush their small ship if they made a wrong turn. The Gjøa's shallow draft, which would prove crucial later, initially worked against them. The ship was so light that she rode high on the water, making her vulnerable to being picked up and carried by moving ice. Several times they had to scramble to secure the ship to heavy ice floes to prevent being swept away. Winter was coming, and they were still thousands of miles from their ultimate destination. But Amundsen had studied the journals of previous expeditions, and he knew something that many of his predecessors had learned too late. You don't fight the Arctic winter, you prepare for it. As the days grew shorter and the temperatures plummeted, Amundsen began looking for a safe harbor where they could wait out the polar night. What he found would become their home for the next 3 years. A small bay on the southern coast of King William Island, which they named Gjøa Haven. It looked like salvation, a protected harbor where they could anchor safely while the ice formed around them. They had no idea they were sailing into a prison that would test every limit of human endurance and ingenuity.
September 12th, 1903. As the Gjøa dropped anchor in what would become Gjøa Haven, the crew felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. They had found a safe harbor for the winter, and when spring came, they would continue their historic journey. What they didn't realize was that they had just entered a trap that would hold them for nearly 3 years. The bay seemed perfect at first, protected from the worst Arctic storms by surrounding hills, with fresh water available from nearby streams, and signs that local Inuit had used the area for hunting and fishing. It was exactly the kind of place polar explorers dreamed of finding. But as the weeks passed and the temperature dropped, a terrifying reality began to emerge. The ice that formed around their ship wasn't the temporary, seasonal ice they had expected. This was thick, permanent ice that showed no signs of breaking up when spring returned. They were trapped. The Gjøa, designed to bend with the ice, found herself locked in a frozen grip that grew stronger every day. What had started as thin sheets of ice along the shoreline thickened into a solid mass several feet deep. The ship that had carried them thousands of miles was now completely immobilized, frozen into the Arctic Ocean like a fly in amber. As the polar night descended,
Months of complete darkness when the sun never rises above the horizon. The crew faced a psychological challenge that had broken many previous Arctic expeditions. Confined to a ship barely 70 feet long, 7 men had to somehow maintain their sanity and morale through the longest, darkest, coldest nights on Earth. The inside of the Gjøa became their entire world. The main cabin, perhaps 12 feet by 8 feet, served as kitchen, dining room, library, workshop, and social center. Personal space was measured in inches. Privacy was non-existent. Every sound, every smell, every habit of every crew member became magnified by the forced proximity. Temperatures inside the ship, even with their small stove burning constantly, rarely rose above freezing. Water froze solid in cups if left unattended for more than a few minutes. Their breath formed ice crystals that accumulated on the walls and ceiling, creating a constant rain of frozen condensation. Outside, the world had become an alien landscape of endless white. Temperatures dropped to 60 below zero Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to make metal so brittle that it would shatter if dropped, cold enough to make the simple act of breathing painful. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of their situation was the growing realization that they might be trapped for much longer than a single winter. Antarctic expert that he was, Amundsen had studied the ice patterns of the Arctic extensively. He knew that some ships had been trapped for multiple years, and he began to suspect that the ice conditions in their particular location might not break up for several seasons. This meant their carefully calculated food supplies, planned for a 2-year expedition, might have to last 3 years or more. It meant their fuel reserves, essential for heating and cooking, would have to be stretched beyond their original estimates. Most importantly, it meant 7 men would have to maintain hope and cooperation for an indefinite period in one of the most stressful environments on Earth. The first signs of trouble appeared within weeks of being iced in. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that had killed more polar explorers than cold or starvation, began to show its early symptoms: fatigue, joint pain, and mood changes that could easily be attributed to the stress of their situation. But Amundsen, having witnessed scurvy's effects on previous expeditions, recognized the warning signs. Their food supplies, carefully preserved and rationed, were already showing signs of deterioration in the extreme cold. Canned goods froze solid, requiring dangerous amounts of precious fuel to thaw before eating. Fresh provisions were completely exhausted, leaving them dependent on preserved foods that might have to last for years. The psychological strain was perhaps worse than the physical challenges. Gustav Wieck, their magnetic observer, began showing signs of severe depression and paranoia. Confined to the ship with the same 6 men day after day, with no escape and no privacy, personality conflicts that might have been minor annoyances in normal circumstances became major sources of tension. But Amundsen proved to be as brilliant a leader as he was an explorer. Recognizing that morale and routine were essential for survival, he instituted a strict schedule of activities that kept the crew busy and mentally engaged. Daily scientific observations continued regardless of weather conditions. Someone had to venture outside every few hours to record temperature, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. These routine tasks, as dangerous as they were in the extreme conditions, provided structure and purpose. Educational lectures became a regular evening activity.
Each crew member was expected to share knowledge about their area of expertise, teaching the others about navigation, meteorology, engineering, or Arctic survival. These sessions provided mental stimulation and helped maintain the intellectual curiosity that had brought them to the Arctic in the first place. Physical exercise, as difficult as it was in their cramped quarters, became mandatory. They created workout routines that could be performed in the confined space of the ship, understanding that physical fitness was essential for both health and morale. But perhaps most importantly, Amundsen began to study the one group of people who had not just survived in the Arctic, but thrived there for thousands of years, the local Inuit. As winter deepened and their situation became more desperate, Amundsen made a decision that would save their lives and change the course of polar exploration forever. Instead of fighting the Arctic, they were going to learn to live with it.
February 1904, 5 months into their first Arctic winter, when despair had settled over the crew like the endless polar night, salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. Figures appeared on the horizon, human shapes moving across the ice with an ease and confidence that seemed impossible in the brutal conditions. The local Netsilik Inuit had found the strange ship frozen in their traditional hunting grounds. For Amundsen, this first contact represented more than just relief from isolation. It was the beginning of an education that would revolutionize polar exploration and save his crew's lives. The Inuit who approached the Gjøa were masters of Arctic survival in ways that European explorers had never imagined. They lived comfortably in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. They traveled efficiently across ice that was impassable to conventional expeditions. They found food where others saw only a frozen wasteland. Most remarkably, they seemed genuinely happy. While Amundsen's crew struggled with depression, confinement, and the constant stress of survival, these Arctic natives lived full, rich lives in an environment that Europeans considered barely habitable. They had families, complex social structures, sophisticated technologies, and a deep understanding of the Arctic ecosystem that had been refined over millennia. Amundsen, unlike many explorers of his era, recognized an opportunity when he saw one. Instead of maintaining the typical European attitude of cultural superiority, he approached the Inuit as teachers. He wanted to learn everything they could teach him about surviving and thriving in the Arctic. The lessons began immediately. Clothing. The bulky wool and canvas outerwear that European explorers traditionally wore was revealed to be not just inefficient, but potentially deadly. Wool became heavy and useless when wet. Canvas trapped moisture and conducted cold. The complex layering systems that seemed logical to European minds actually worked against the body's natural temperature regulation. The Inuit had developed a completely different approach: caribou fur clothing, with its hollow hairs that trapped warm air while allowing moisture to escape. Sealskin boots that were waterproof but breathable. Layering systems that could be adjusted quickly for different activities and conditions. Amundsen and his crew began to adopt Inuit clothing designs, modifying their European gear or trading for native-made items. The difference was immediate and dramatic. They could work outside for longer periods, travel more efficiently, and maintain body temperature with far less effort. Shelter. European polar tents, designed for temperate climates, were inadequate for Arctic conditions. They were heavy, difficult to set up in wind, and impossible to heat efficiently. The Inuit snow house, the igloo, represented thousands of years of engineering evolution for Arctic conditions. Amundsen learned to build igloos that could be constructed in under an hour.
that provided better insulation than any European tent, and that could withstand Arctic storms that would destroy conventional shelters. More importantly, he learned the principles behind igloo construction, understanding how the physics of snow and ice could be used to create warm, comfortable living spaces even in the most brutal conditions. Transportation. European explorers traditionally fought against Arctic conditions, using brute force to move heavy sleds across difficult terrain. The Inuit had learned to work with the environment, developing lightweight sleds and dog teams that could travel efficiently across snow, ice, and broken terrain. Amundsen became fascinated with dog sled management. He learned how to select and train dogs for Arctic travel, how to load sleds for maximum efficiency, and how to read ice and snow conditions to choose the safest and fastest routes. Food. Perhaps most critically, he learned how the Inuit found food in an environment that seemed completely barren to European eyes. Seal hunting through breathing holes in the ice fishing techniques that could provide fresh protein throughout the winter, methods for preserving meat and fat that provided essential nutrition for months, the knowledge of which Arctic plants provided vitamins necessary to prevent scurvy. This last lesson probably saved their lives. The Inuit taught them about Arctic willow and other local plants that contained vitamin C, providing a natural remedy for the scurvy that was beginning to affect the crew. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The Inuit had learned to embrace Arctic life rather than simply endure it. They found joy in the beauty of the northern lights, satisfaction in successful hunts, pleasure in the company of family and friends during the long winter nights. Amundsen began to apply this attitude to his own situation. Instead of counting the days until they could escape the Arctic, he started to appreciate the unique opportunities their forced stay provided. They were living among people who existed nowhere else on Earth, learning skills that no European explorers had ever mastered, gathering knowledge that could revolutionize polar exploration. The relationship between the Norwegian explorers and the Netsilik Inuit became genuinely collaborative. The Inuit were fascinated by European technology, metal tools, firearms, and manufactured goods that could make their traditional lives easier. In return, they shared knowledge that was literally priceless for Arctic survival. Trading sessions became regular social events. The Norwegians offered knives, needles, wood, and other manufactured items. The Inuit provided clothing, food, hunting equipment, and most importantly, education in Arctic survival. As the months passed, Amundsen's crew began to transform from European explorers trapped in the Arctic into something new, hybrid Arctic European survival experts who could thrive in conditions that would have killed their former selves. But they were still trapped in the ice. And as their first Arctic winter finally ended, they faced a devastating realization. The ice around their ship showed no signs of breaking up. They weren't going anywhere anytime soon.
Spring 1904 arrived, not with the relief of melting ice and open water, but with the crushing realization that their imprisonment was far from over. The ice that held the Gjøa in its grip had thickened to over 6 feet in places. Even as air temperatures rose above freezing, the massive volume of ice showed no signs of breaking up. What they had hoped would be a single winter's delay had become something much more serious, a multi-year captivity in one of the most remote places on Earth. For some members of the crew, this realization was devastating. Gustav Wieck, their magnetic observer, had been struggling with depression and paranoia throughout the winter. The prospect of another year trapped in close quarters with the same 6 men, in the same tiny ship, in the same isolated bay, pushed him toward a complete psychological breakdown. Week became convinced that the other crew members were plotting against him. He refused to participate in communal meals, hoarded his personal belongings, and spent hours writing letters accusing his shipmates of theft and sabotage. In the confined space of the Gjøa, his paranoia became a constant source of tension that threatened the morale of the entire expedition. Amundsen faced a leadership crisis that had no good solutions. Week was essential for their scientific mission, the magnetic observations that justified their expedition to the Norwegian government and scientific community. But his deteriorating mental state was becoming dangerous for everyone aboard. The situation came to a head when Week accused Adolf Lindström, their cook, of poisoning his food. In the middle of an Arctic night, with temperatures hovering around 40 below zero, Week attempted to leave the ship and walk south towards civilization, a journey of over 1,000 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It took the combined efforts of the entire crew to restrain him and bring him back aboard. But the incident made clear that their psychological survival was as challenging as their physical survival. Amundsen made one of the most difficult decisions of his leadership career. Week would continue his scientific work, but he would be closely supervised at all times. Personal weapons were secured, and most importantly, the crew would redouble their efforts to maintain morale and mental health for everyone aboard. The solution came through deeper integration with their Inuit neighbors. Rather than remaining prisoners aboard their frozen ship, Amundsen organized extended hunting and traveling expeditions with local Inuit families. These trips, sometimes lasting weeks, provided crucial psychological relief from the confined quarters of the Gjøa while teaching valuable Arctic survival skills. Helmer Hansen proved particularly adept at sled dog management, learning to handle teams of 10, 12 dogs across terrain that would have been impassable for Europeans just a year earlier. His skill became so advanced that local Inuit considered him one of their own when it came to Arctic travel. Anton Lund, their engineer, became fascinated with Inuit technology and began creating hybrid tools that combined European manufacturing techniques with traditional Arctic designs. His innovations in cold weather equipment maintenance kept their essential gear functioning in conditions that routinely destroyed conventional equipment. Godfrid Hansen focused on navigation and mapping, creating detailed charts of the local coastline and ice conditions that would prove invaluable for future Arctic expeditions. His work represented the first accurate mapping of this remote region. But perhaps most importantly, the entire crew was becoming physically and mentally adapted to Arctic life in ways that no previous European expedition had achieved. Their diet now consisted largely of fresh seal and caribou meat, providing the fats and proteins necessary for cold weather metabolism. They had learned to supplement this with Arctic plants and preserved foods in combinations that prevented scurvy and other nutritional diseases. Their daily routines had evolved to match Arctic rhythms rather than fight against them. During the periods of 24-hour daylight, they remained active for extended periods, traveling and hunting when conditions were optimal. During the polar night, they adapted to a more sedentary lifestyle, focused on equipment maintenance, scientific observation, and social activities. Their physical conditioning had transformed dramatically. Bodies that had been accustomed to temperate climates had adapted to efficiently burn fat for energy in cold conditions. Their cardiovascular systems had adjusted to the thinner air and extreme temperature variations. Most remarkably, their psychological resilience had grown to accommodate stress levels that would have broken their former selves. They were becoming something unprecedented in the history of polar exploration. Europeans who could not just survive in the Arctic, but actually thrive there. But even as their personal survival skills reached unprecedented levels, their situation remained desperate in other ways. Their supplies, carefully calculated for a 2-year expedition, were now stretched into a 3rd year. Fuel for heating and cooking was severely rationed. Essential equipment was wearing out with no possibility of replacement. Most critically, they had no way of communicating with the outside world to let anyone know they were alive. As far as their families and sponsors knew, the entire expedition had vanished without a trace into the Arctic Ocean. Back in Norway, they were presumed dead. Memorial services had been held. Insurance policies had been paid out. The Gjøa expedition had become another tragic footnote in the history of polar exploration. But unknown to the grieving families and disappointed sponsors, 7 men aboard a tiny wooden ship were not just surviving in the Arctic, they were mastering it. As their second winter approached, they faced the cold and darkness not with the desperation of their first year, but with the confidence of people who had learned to make the impossible merely difficult. They had held on through conditions that would have killed them a year earlier. Now they were about to discover if their hard-won expertise would be enough to survive even longer in their Arctic prison.
November 1905. More than 2 years into their Arctic captivity, death finally claimed one of the Gjøa's crew. Gustav Vik, the magnetic observer whose mental health had deteriorated so dramatically during their imprisonment, succumbed to what appeared to be heart failure on a brutally cold morning when temperatures had dropped to nearly 50 below zero. His death was not entirely unexpected. The combination of extreme stress, inadequate nutrition, and the psychological trauma of prolonged Arctic isolation had taken a devastating toll on his already fragile mental state. In the weeks before his death, he had become increasingly withdrawn, refusing food and spending long hours staring out at the endless ice. For the surviving crew members, Vik's death represented both a personal tragedy and a terrifying reminder of their own mortality. They were so far from any medical help that even minor injuries or illnesses could become fatal. Every cough, every ache, every sign of physical distress took on a significance that would have been unimaginable in civilization. But Vik's death also marked a turning point in their scientific mission. Despite his personal struggles, Vik had continued his magnetic observations throughout their imprisonment, creating a dataset that was unprecedented in polar science. His measurements from their fixed position at Gjøa Haven provided the first long-term magnetic data from this crucial location near the magnetic North Pole. Roald Amundsen recognized that Vik's work represented a scientific achievement that could justify their entire expedition, regardless of whether they ever completed the Northwest Passage. The magnetic data they were collecting was revolutionizing understanding of Earth's magnetic field and its variations. But more discoveries were coming. With Vik's death, responsibility for magnetic observations fell to Godfred Hansen, who brought a different perspective to the scientific work. Hansen began to notice patterns in the magnetic variations that Vik had recorded but never fully analyzed. The magnetic North Pole, the point where Earth's magnetic field lines converge, was not a fixed location as scientists had assumed. It was moving, shifting its position over time in response to changes deep within Earth's core. This discovery would revolutionize navigation and scientific understanding of planetary magnetism. Ships and explorers throughout the Arctic had been using magnetic compass readings based on the assumption that magnetic north was a fixed point. Hansen's analysis of their long-term data proved that assumption wrong. The implications were staggering. Every magnetic map in existence was potentially inaccurate. Navigation throughout the Arctic would have to be completely reconsidered. The very nature of Earth's magnetic field was more dynamic and complex than anyone had imagined. But even as they made groundbreaking scientific discoveries, their situation remained desperate. Their third winter was approaching, and their supplies were stretched to the breaking point. Fuel reserves were so low that they could only heat the ship for a few hours each day. Food stocks were supplemented entirely by hunting and trading with the Inuit, making them completely dependent on the success of their daily survival efforts. Most critically, their ship was showing signs of serious structural damage from the constant pressure of the ice. The Gjøa's hull, designed to flex with ice pressure rather than resist it, had been stressed beyond its design limits. Water was seeping through gaps in the planking that expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The mast showed stress fractures that could lead to complete failure in high winds. They were facing the possibility that even if the ice finally released them, their ship might not be seaworthy enough to complete their journey. Amundsen made the decision to begin preparing for the possibility of overland evacuation. If the Gjøa became inhabitable, or if the ice never released them, they would have to attempt a journey of over 1,000 miles across Arctic terrain to reach the nearest settlement. This preparation involved learning advanced Arctic travel techniques from their Inuit neighbors, extended sled journeys to cache supplies along potential evacuation routes, training in winter camping techniques that could keep them alive during a months-long overland trek. Most importantly, building the physical and mental endurance necessary to attempt one of the most challenging journeys in polar exploration history. But as they prepared for the worst-case scenario, something unexpected began to happen. Spring 1906 brought weather conditions unlike anything they had experienced during their imprisonment. Unusually warm temperatures, earlier than normal. Strong winds from directions that began to break up the massive ice formations that had held them captive. For the first time in nearly 3 years, they heard a sound that had become almost mythical, the cracking and groaning of moving ice. The Arctic Ocean, which had been their prison for so long, was finally beginning to stir. Massive ice floes that had seemed permanently locked in place began to shift and separate. Leads of open water appeared between ice formations, creating dark channels that reflected the sky like mirrors. Most remarkably, the thick ice immediately around the Gjøa began to show signs of weakness. Pressure ridges that had built up over multiple winters started to collapse. The solid ice that had gripped their ship like a vice began to develop cracks and fissures. After 969 days, nearly 3 full years trapped in Arctic ice, the crew of the Gjøa began to hope that their imprisonment might finally be ending. But hope had disappointed them so many times before. They had learned not to trust the Arctic's promises. Even as they began to prepare the ship for potential departure, they remained cautious about believing that their ordeal was truly coming to an end. The ice had taught them patience, endurance, and humility. Now they would discover if it had also taught them enough to finally escape their frozen prison and complete the journey that had brought them to this impossible place. Their survival had depended on holding on through 3 years of Arctic hell. Now everything would depend on whether they could hold their damaged ship together long enough to finish what they had started.
November 1905. More than 2 years into their Arctic captivity, death finally claimed one of the Gjøa's crew. Gustav Vik, the magnetic observer whose mental health had deteriorated so dramatically during their imprisonment, succumbed to what appeared to be heart failure on a brutally cold morning when temperatures had dropped to nearly 50 below zero. His death was not entirely unexpected. The combination of extreme stress, inadequate nutrition, and the psychological trauma of prolonged Arctic isolation had taken a devastating toll on his already fragile mental state. In the weeks before his death, he had become increasingly withdrawn, refusing food and spending long hours staring out at the endless ice. For the surviving crew members, Vik's death represented both a personal tragedy and a terrifying reminder of their own mortality. They were so far from any medical help that even minor injuries or illnesses could become fatal. Every cough, every ache, every sign of physical distress took on a significance that would have been unimaginable in civilization. But Vik's death also marked a turning point in their scientific mission. Despite his personal struggles, Vik had continued his magnetic observations throughout their imprisonment, creating a dataset that was unprecedented in polar science. His measurements from their fixed position at Gjøa Haven provided the first long-term magnetic data from this crucial location near the magnetic North Pole. Roald Amundsen recognized that Vik's work represented a scientific achievement that could justify their entire expedition, regardless of whether they ever completed the Northwest Passage. The magnetic data they were collecting was revolutionizing understanding of Earth's magnetic field and its variations. But more discoveries were coming. With Vik's death, responsibility for magnetic observations fell to Godfred Hansen, who brought a different perspective to the scientific work. Hansen began to notice patterns in the magnetic variations that Vik had recorded but never fully analyzed. The magnetic North Pole, the point where Earth's magnetic field lines converge, was not a fixed location as scientists had assumed. It was moving, shifting its position over time in response to changes deep within Earth's core. This discovery would revolutionize navigation and scientific understanding of planetary magnetism. Ships and explorers throughout the Arctic had been using magnetic compass readings based on the assumption that magnetic north was a fixed point. Hansen's analysis of their long-term data proved that assumption wrong. The implications were staggering. Every magnetic map in existence was potentially inaccurate. Navigation throughout the Arctic would have to be completely reconsidered. The very nature of Earth's magnetic field was more dynamic and complex than anyone had imagined. But even as they made groundbreaking scientific discoveries, their situation remained desperate. Their third winter was approaching, and their supplies were stretched to the breaking point. Fuel reserves were so low that they could only heat the ship for a few hours each day. Food stocks were supplemented entirely by hunting and trading with the Inuit, making them completely dependent on the success of their daily survival efforts. Most critically, their ship was showing signs of serious structural damage from the constant pressure of the ice. The Gjøa's hull, designed to flex with ice pressure rather than resist it, had been stressed beyond its design limits. Water was seeping through gaps in the planking that expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The mast showed stress fractures that could lead to complete failure in high winds. They were facing the possibility that even if the ice finally released them, their ship might not be seaworthy enough to complete their journey. Amundsen made the decision to begin preparing for the possibility of overland evacuation. If the Gjøa became inhabitable,
or if the ice never released them, they would have to attempt a journey of over 1,000 miles across Arctic terrain to reach the nearest settlement. This preparation involved learning advanced Arctic travel techniques from their Inuit neighbors, extended sled journeys to cache supplies along potential evacuation routes, training in winter camping techniques that could keep them alive during a months-long overland trek. Most importantly, building the physical and mental endurance necessary to attempt one of the most challenging journeys in polar exploration history. But as they prepared for the worst-case scenario, something unexpected began to happen. Spring 1906 brought weather conditions unlike anything they had experienced during their imprisonment. Unusually warm temperatures, earlier than normal. Strong winds from directions that began to break up the massive ice formations that had held them captive. For the first time in nearly 3 years, they heard a sound that had become almost mythical, the cracking and groaning of moving ice. The Arctic Ocean, which had been their prison for so long, was finally beginning to stir. Massive ice floes that had seemed permanently locked in place began to shift and separate. Leads of open water appeared between ice formations, creating dark channels that reflected the sky like mirrors. Most remarkably, the thick ice immediately around the Gjøa began to show signs of weakness. Pressure ridges that had built up over multiple winters started to collapse. The solid ice that had gripped their ship like a vice began to develop cracks and fissures. After 969 days, nearly 3 full years trapped in Arctic ice, the crew of the Gjøa began to hope that their imprisonment might finally be ending. But hope had disappointed them so many times before. They had learned not to trust the Arctic's promises. Even as they began to prepare the ship for potential departure, they remained cautious about believing that their ordeal was truly coming to an end. The ice had taught them patience, endurance, and humility. Now they would discover if it had also taught them enough to finally escape their frozen prison and complete the journey that had brought them to this impossible place. Their survival had depended on holding on through 3 years of Arctic hell. Now everything would depend on whether they could hold their damaged ship together long enough to finish what they had started.
August 13th, 1906. Nearly 3 years to the day since the ice had first begun forming around their ship, Helmer Hansen came running into the main cabin with words that seemed too impossible to believe. "The ice is moving. There's open water." After 1,056 days trapped in their Arctic prison, the crew of the Gjøa rushed outside to witness something they had almost given up hope of ever seeing again: their ship floating freely in dark, open water. The ice that had held them captive for so long had finally released its grip, not gradually as they had expected, but suddenly and dramatically. Massive ice floes that had seemed permanent were breaking apart and drifting away, creating channels of navigable water for the first time since their imprisonment began. But their elation was tempered by harsh reality. The Gjøa, after 3 years of ice pressure and structural stress, was in terrible condition. Water poured through gaps in the hull that had opened and closed repeatedly during the freeze-thaw cycles. The mast showed dangerous stress fractures. The rigging had deteriorated to the point where it might not survive strong winds. Most critically, their small diesel engine, which had been temperamental even when new, had suffered damage from years of extreme cold that made it completely unreliable. They had perhaps days, maybe weeks before winter conditions returned and trapped them for another year. If they were going to escape, it had to be now, in a ship that was barely seaworthy. Amundsen made the decision that would define the rest of their expedition. They were leaving immediately, regardless of the condition of their ship or the approaching winter weather. The crew worked frantically to make the Gjøa as seaworthy as possible. Every gap in the hull was plugged with whatever materials they could find. The rigging was reinforced with spare rope and improvised supports. Most importantly, they secured all the scientific equipment and observations that represented 3 years of invaluable research. Their Inuit friends, who had become genuine companions over the years of shared hardship, helped with the departure preparations. These remarkable people had saved their lives repeatedly, shared their knowledge freely, and provided the human companionship that had kept them sane during their imprisonment. The goodbye was emotional and difficult. They were leaving behind people who had become family, departing from a place that had been both prison and home, abandoning the site of some of the most important scientific discoveries in polar history. But they were also finally continuing the journey that had brought them to the Arctic in the first place, the conquest of the Northwest Passage. On August 13, 1906, the Gjøa began moving under her own power for the first time in nearly 3 years. The sensation was almost surreal. Their ship, which had been a stationary building for so long, was once again a vessel capable of carrying them across the ocean. The immediate challenges were enormous. They were navigating through ice conditions that changed by the hour, in a damaged ship with inadequate charts, using navigation equipment that had been stressed by years of extreme cold. But they had advantages that no previous Northwest Passage expedition had possessed. 3 years of Arctic experience had made them experts in ice navigation. Their time with the Inuit had taught them to read weather and ice conditions with unprecedented skill. Most importantly, they had developed the psychological resilience necessary to function effectively under extreme stress. Progress was measured in miles per day rather than hundreds of miles per week. They would advance when conditions permitted, anchor in protected bays when storms threatened, and constantly repair their ship as new problems developed. The engine failed completely within days of their departure, leaving them dependent entirely on sail power in an area where winds were unpredictable and often contrary to their desired course. But their years of forced patience had taught them to work with conditions rather than fight them. When winds were favorable, they sailed. When winds were contrary, they anchored and waited. When ice blocked their path, they found alternate routes or waited for conditions to change. The aggressive schedule that had driven their original expedition had been replaced by the patient pragmatism that had kept them alive during their imprisonment. Slowly, steadily, they began to make progress through the maze of islands and ice that comprised the final sections of the Northwest Passage. Each mile eastward was a victory. Each day without major disaster was a gift. Each successful navigation challenge brought them closer to a goal that seemed impossible during the darkest days of their Arctic captivity. But they were still in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, in a damaged ship, racing against the return of winter conditions that could trap them again or destroy them completely. The Northwest Passage, which had killed so many explorers before them, was about to face its greatest test. 7 men who had learned to survive anything the Arctic could throw at them, determined to complete a journey that had started as exploration and become the ultimate test of human endurance.
December 5th, 1906. After 3 years, 4 months, and 19 days since leaving Norway, the Gjøa limped into the port of Nome, Alaska, flying the Norwegian flag and carrying 7 men who had accomplished something many considered impossible. They had successfully navigated the Northwest Passage. They had survived 3 years trapped in Arctic ice.
They had made groundbreaking scientific discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of Earth's magnetic field. But perhaps most remarkably, they had transformed themselves from European explorers into something unprecedented. People who could not just survive in the Arctic, but actually thrive there. The news of their success spread around the world like wildfire. The expedition that had been mourned as lost became celebrated as one of the greatest achievements in polar exploration. Roald Amundsen became an international hero, the man who had finally conquered the waterway that had defeated explorers for over 400 years. But for the men who had lived through the experience, the triumph was more complex than simple victory. They had left Norway as confident young men with a clear goal and a reasonable plan. They returned as fundamentally changed human beings who had been tested beyond the normal limits of human endurance and had discovered reserves of strength and resilience they never knew they possessed. Helmer Hansen had become one of the most skilled Arctic travelers in the world, with dog handling and ice navigation abilities that rivaled those of people who had spent their entire lives in the Arctic. His skills would later prove crucial to Amundsen's successful expedition to the South Pole. Anton Lund had developed engineering and repair capabilities that could keep complex equipment functioning in conditions that would destroy normal machinery. His innovations in cold weather technology influenced Arctic exploration for decades. Godfrid Hansen had created navigation and magnetic observation techniques that became standard for polar expeditions. His scientific work during their captivity provided data that was used by researchers for generations. Adolf Lindström had mastered the art of maintaining nutrition and morale under impossible conditions, skills that would make him one of the most sought-after expedition cooks in polar exploration. Petter Ristvid had become an expert in Arctic meteorology, able to predict weather patterns and ice conditions with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to those who hadn't lived through 3 Arctic winters. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned the most valuable lesson that the Arctic could teach: the power of refusing to give up. During their 3 years of captivity, there had been countless moments when surrender would have been easier than continuation. Times when the cold seemed unbearable, when food was scarce, when hope seemed pointless, when the psychological pressure of confinement and isolation pushed them to their breaking points. Yet somehow, day after day, month after month, year after year, they had chosen to keep fighting. They had adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. They had learned when learning required abandoning everything they thought they knew. They had supported each other when individual survival would have been easier. Most remarkably, they had maintained hope when hope appeared to be pure delusion. Their story became more than just an exploration achievement. It became a testament to human resilience in the face of impossible odds. The scientific discoveries they made during their forced stay were groundbreaking. Their magnetic observations revolutionized navigation throughout the Arctic. Their ethnographic work with the Netsilik Inuit provided insights into Arctic survival that saved countless lives in subsequent expeditions. Their detailed mapping of previously unknown coastlines opened new regions to exploration and trade. But the real discovery was simpler and more profound. Human beings are capable of surviving and adapting to conditions that seem far beyond the limits of human endurance. The Gjøa expedition proved that with the right combination of preparation, leadership, adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit, people can survive almost anything. They showed that isolation doesn't have to mean despair, that confinement doesn't have to break the human spirit, and that learning from others, especially from people whose cultures have mastered the challenges you're facing, can mean the difference between life and death. Their 3 years in the Arctic weren't just about survival. They were about transformation. 7 men who entered the Arctic as typical European explorers emerged as something new, hybrid Arctic European survival experts who had learned to thrive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. In our modern world, where we face different but equally challenging obstacles, their story provides a template for endurance that transcends time and circumstance. We may not face 3 years trapped in Arctic ice, but we all encounter situations that seem impossible to overcome. Economic hardship that stretches on indefinitely, health challenges that require years of treatment and recovery, personal losses that seem too devastating to survive, professional setbacks that threaten everything we've worked for. The lesson of the Gjøa expedition is simple but profound. When you can't change your circumstances, you can change yourself. When you can't fight your environment, you can learn to work with it. When you can't rely on your old knowledge and skills, you can acquire new ones. Most importantly, when giving up seems like the only rational choice, you can choose to hold on for one more day, and then another, until the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes routine. Roald Amundsen and his crew didn't conquer the Northwest Passage through superior technology or overwhelming force. They succeeded through patience, adaptability, and the absolute refusal to surrender to circumstances that would have defeated most people. They held on when holding on seemed pointless. They learned when learning required abandoning their pride. They adapted when adaptation meant becoming completely different people than they had been when their journey started. This has been Hold On, Survival Stories. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through 3 years of Arctic survival with the crew of the Gjøa. If their story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who need to be reminded that no matter how impossible your situation seems, no matter how long you've been trapped by circumstances beyond your control, no matter how distant rescue appears, your breakthrough might be just around the corner. Until next time, remember, when the ice closes in and traps you far from everything familiar, when the darkness seems endless and the cold threatens to break your spirit, when you're down to your last reserves and hope feels like a luxury you can't afford, hold on. Your moment of freedom might be just around the corner.